Good evening. This is so close to the end of our 1960 trip that it is very natural for me to look back and review what has happened since the trip began. When we start out on a trip like this, I never know what the nature of the message is going to be or what form it is going to take. And so it is that I watch in each city, in each class, each lecture, to see what it is that is unfolding and what kind of a pattern it makes. And so it is that by the end of a trip, I can look back and see how a definite pattern has formed, how some particular message has come out into expression. The outstanding idea or clarification that I have witnessed this trip is this. Before the days when we knew anything about electricity and its uses, it would have been a very difficult thing to say to this world, do you know there is a principle available to us, closer to us than breathing, right here in the air that we breathe, that if we tune into it or if we hook it up, will give us light, heat, cold, energy, power. Oh yes, we know about sunlight, we know about, oh no, this is a power that no one knows anything about. You can't see it, hear it, taste it, touch it, or smell it. And yet, it will do all of these things for us. And you can realize how difficult it would have been to convince anyone of that until an actual demonstration was given. In the same way, some of you, like myself, can remember the days before wireless telegraphy, and remember even how it was spoken about that if there were such a thing, if it were possible to communicate with ships at sea, what a great benefit it would be to them and how many tragedies would be averted. And little did we dream that not only there was a power available to us that would enable us to communicate with ships at sea, but more than that, we could bring this right into our homes and hear the great news of the day, the philosophies of the day, the music. Everything could be brought right into our homes through this very power of wireless. How many other things can we remember that within our own lifespans would not have been possible to explain or make anyone believe in? And now they are accepted as commonplace. And so the outstanding idea that has clarified itself to me is this, that we too are dealing with something that the world does not believe in, because it can't see it, hear it, taste it, touch it, or smell it, and it has been trying to contact it erroneously. And therefore, it cannot believe that right here where we are, closer than breathing, filling this space, this air that we breathe, filling our very being and body, that there is also a power, a something that can transform any life, that can bring about as drastic a change as from sin to purity, from poverty to abundance, from disease to health, almost from death to life. And here it is, all about us. The world has been seeking it for thousands of years under the name of God, and has been searching for it in every way that would help to keep it hidden. Instead of arriving at an awareness of this principle, of this law, of this presence, of this power, that would make it available to all of us. Now, every one of you who has witnessed a physical, mental, moral, or financial healing, or the healing of human relationships, has seen this presence or power at work. Or rather, you have witnessed the result or fruitage of it, even while not knowing what this it really is, or without knowing how it functions, or how to bring it into your experience. Now, out of our experience, we bring this to you, that this that we call God, this that we call the presence or the power of God, can be brought into our individual experience, and eventually into all collective experience, and by a way that is known, by a way that may be practiced by anyone who has, to start with, the leading, the inspiration, the desire to find it. Above all things, you must remember this. This presence or power is not available to those who close their minds to it, because nothing can enter our experience unless it enters by means of our own consciousness. And this may explain to you why you may have tried to help someone with truth. You may have tried to bring healing to someone with truth, and found that they did not respond, or that it did not work. Actually, it wasn't because it didn't work. It was because there was a closed door through which it could not enter. And that door is the door of individual consciousness. We do have the ability to shut it out. Everyone has the ability to reject truth or God or Spirit. And, strangely enough, many who most earnestly believe that they are seeking it are most effectively shutting it out. Well, there are many reasons for this. The most important is that most people have a concept of what God is and what God is supposed to do for them and the way in which God is supposed to be received. And if the subject is presented outside of that particular way, the mind is shut to bar it out. In other words, there are some people who cannot accept it on Sunday because Saturday is the Sabbath. And there are those who cannot accept it on Saturday because Sunday is the Sabbath. And there are others who cannot receive it unless it has a crucifix attached to it. Others cannot receive it unless it has a swastika attached to it. In other words, each one tries to have God fit into a pattern which they have been told about, and they cannot accept it in any other way. This was, of course, the experience of Jesus Christ and his crucifixion. The people to whom Jesus spoke had been told how many hours on Saturday they must be in temple and how much sacrificing they must do, and of the trip that they must make annually to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and the animals that must be sacrificed, and the tithes that must be given, so that when the Master said, "It is not to be found in holy mountains or in temples in Jerusalem, and God has no pleasure in your sacrificing," and when he told them of the way in which God could be received, they remembered how they had been taught. Naturally, they rejected him, they rejected his message, and only those who could actually rise above the teachings of their church, only those who could discard many of the things that they had been taught, only they were able to follow the Master, and then only in part. You remember that many years after the crucifixion, Peter still had not lost his belief that God could not be had if you ate the meat of a pig. And how many years after the Master's crucifixion was it that they still believed that God was available only to Hebrews, only to those who were circumcised, only to those who were of that Hebrew family? Why, it was more than 30 years after the crucifixion before they consented to going into foreign countries and preaching the gospel to others than Hebrews. And even then they made a lot of trouble about it. So it is that there are many to whom you would like to give the benefits of the spiritual presence and power, who would reject it because it doesn't come in the form and in the way in which they expect it. And to some degree, we are like the disciples. We also have not been willing to forget all that we were taught. Many of us still insist on praying for ourselves and for our friends and for our relatives. In spite of the Master's, "It profiteth you nothing to pray for your friends. Ye must pray for your enemies." And if we could take a poll of all of our Infinite Way students, I wonder how many could truthfully answer that they are giving a portion of each day to praying for their enemies to find out if Jesus was telling the truth. That in order to become a son of God, a child of God, you have to pray for your enemies. That is the way to become a child of God. And think of how many there are trying to be children of God who completely ignore that passage. And in the same way, all of these other passages, such as resist not evil and forgive 70 times 7. In other words, and here it is, and this is the difficult part, be transformed through the renewing of the mind. In other words, how many of us, even in this study, still believe that we can go on being human beings, having the same human emotions, loving the ones we want to love and hating the ones we want to hate and ignoring the ones we want to ignore, holding others in condemnation, judgment, criticism, holding others in the grievances because of their ills to us. How many of us still believe that we can go on being this human being and still find the kingdom of God within us? And the answer is it can't be done. The kingdom of God, the miracle of this presence and power, which is so close to us, is that it can only be experienced through a transformation of consciousness. We have to be the ones, again, quoting the Master, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Ye shall pray for your enemies. Ye shall resist not evil. Ye. Always it is you, the individual you, who has to fit yourself to receive God's grace. You see, many people misunderstand that term, God's grace. And they think of it as something that has a starting point. In other words, God's grace isn't functioning for me now, and how can I bring it to function for me? Or, what must I do and how many years must I wait before God's grace touches me? And the truth is this: God's grace is functioning this very instant, and it has been functioning for you since time began. Whether or not you are receiving the effects of it, the results of it, the fruitage of it, has nothing to do with God, and has nothing to do with God's grace. It has to do with you. In other words, out here in this garden, the laws of nature are at work. And within a few weeks, you will notice a change that is really being brought about now. Right now, there is a change taking place in the earth which will cause these vines and plants to lose these flowers. Right now, there is a process going on which is causing these leaves to turn color and to fall away. Now, this is not going to happen in the future. This is taking place right now. The only thing that's going to take place in the future is the actual turning of the colors and the dropping off of the branches. But that which is to produce that effect is operative and operating right now. And as a matter of fact, there is that operating in this earth which is preparing these trees and plants for a rebirth next spring. In other words, God is not going to start doing something on a certain day. God is not going to stop doing something on a certain day. The process of God is a continuous one. So it is that the grace of God is not going to function in you after you have read a certain amount of books or after you have meditated a certain amount of times or after you have done a certain amount of good deeds. The grace of God is functioning in you at this moment. But the question is, and this is the question the Master raised, what about the soil? Fertile soil, rocky soil, barren soil. And our consciousness is the soil in which the grace of God operates. And if we have barren soil, the grace of God never comes into visibility as fruitage. If we have rocky soil, it may produce a little flower here and there, a little demonstration here and there, but these soon wither, and there is no permanence to them. And so it is that if we are to bear fruit richly and continuously, and permanently, and abundantly, it can only be done through a receptivity of consciousness, a fertile consciousness through which the grace of God can function and become manifest. Now the Master, in pointing out to us all that ye have heard it said in the past, told us definitely what must be eliminated from our consciousness in order to have fertile soil. And then when he tells us, but I say unto you, he then tells us the very specific activities of thought and conduct and being that we must embrace in order that we may have fertile soil. And of course he winds it up by telling us that if you abide in this word which he has given us, remember, and as the Sermon on the Mount, if you abide in this word, if you abide in praying for the enemy, if you abide in forgiving 70 times 7, if you abide in doing unto others as you would have others do unto you, if you would abide in all of this course of consciousness that he has outlined, and if you let me, God, abide in you, then you will bear fruit richly. In other words, the grace of God can now function because you have spiritually fertile soil. Now you see, this letting me abide in you is referred to in all mystical literature as practicing the presence of God. It means acknowledging him in all thy ways so that he may give thee rest. It means keeping the mind stayed on God so that we may find his rest. It means abiding in the assurance of his presence and of his power. And it means accepting one of the great principles revealed by the Master, that there is but one power. In other words, here there needs to be a very definite practice, because all of us were born and brought up in the belief of two powers, a good power and an evil power. And just as the world today is asking itself, is there a God power going to come along and destroy these evil powers? Is there a God power going to save us from bombs or communism? So it is that we too have been hypnotized into believing that there are two powers, so that I'm sure that many of us often also wonder, is God going to come along and destroy the evil powers that threaten us in our generation? And the answer is no. God isn't any more than God ever has before. And that doesn't mean that the world can't be saved any more than it means that we individually can't be saved just because someone has said that there is no medicine with which to cure us. It means, however, that to be saved is going to depend on our ability to mold our consciousness in order that we may be a fertile consciousness, receptive and responsive to the grace of God which is already functioning within us. Now, we bar this power of grace every time we expect a good power to destroy an evil power. Every time we expect God to remove some form of evil, sin, disease, death, lack, or limitation, every time we look to the one good God power to do something to an evil power, we bar its operation. Only in the degree that we can transform our consciousness to where we can accept that thou, God, art the only power, and beside thee there are no other powers. I shall not fear what man can do to me. I shall not fear what conditions can do to me. I shall not fear the armies of the aliens. For all of these have but temporal power, which in the realization of God is no power. Every time that you can bring to conscious remembrance sin, disease, infection, contagion, accident, alcohol, wars, communism, bombs, all of these are temporal powers beyond the flesh, which in the realization of God's allness makes them impotent. Every time you can bring your consciousness to that point, you are not only bringing greater freedom into your experience, you're bringing it into the experience of the entire world. It takes only one with truth to save multitudes. Don't ever forget, just one practitioner has healed tens of thousands of patients. One. Think what 1,000 practitioners can do. In fact, what they have done. One individual whose consciousness is imbued with the realization of God as all power, that one individual is enough to save cities, communities, to stop infections and contagions, to stop storms. One individual quietly, confidently realizing, quietly or confidently looking at Pilate and saying, "Thou couldst have no power over me, except God's power." One individual looking at the crippled and saying, "What did hinder you?" God is the only power. One individual, 2 or more gathered together, or 10 righteous men in a city. All of these indicate how just a few really could save the world. Not by invoking deity, not by praying to God to do something to our enemies, but by settling back in quietness and in confidence and realizing, is there some power other than God? And whence did it come? Who created a power destructive to God or to God's universe? Who gave power to any power to destroy God or God's kingdom? If God is God, meaning if God is infinite and omnipotent and omnipresent and omniscient, whence comes another power? And then, as we individually train ourselves and ultimately bring ourselves to where we can look out at this world and say, just imagine, the only power there is invisible. Therefore, I need not fear anything or anybody in the visible. If it is visible, it has no power. For all power is invisible, for all power is God. Just think now how we can look at our newspapers, how we can listen to our news broadcasts, and quietly remember, and not one bit of this is truth, not one bit of this is power, for only that which is invisible is power, and that is God. Now, this practice is a practice of the presence of God, but it is practicing the truth about God. Praying to God to remove a discord is as nonsensical now as it has been for the past 5,000 years in which it's been practiced. Praying to God to destroy our enemies is as useless today as it has been ever since it was first practiced. Praying to God to save our loved ones is as futile today as it has been throughout all of these ages that it has been practiced. And the fruitage that Jesus speaks of, the rich fruitage that is to come into your life in the form of health, harmony, happiness, peace on earth, goodwill to men. All of this is going to come only through a transformed consciousness that no longer turns to God to ask God to do something, but rather looks out and thanks God that God is already infinite, the all, the only, besides which there is no other. Another thing. We bar the presence, the activity, and the fruitage of God by either consciously or unconsciously believing that God power is something external to us that can or will act upon us. And there is no such thing. That is a paganistic belief that there is a God somewhere that can act upon us for good or for evil. God's power is within you. It does not come to you or act upon you. It functions out from within you. The kingdom of God is within you. It is already closer to you than breathing. The place whereon you stand is holy ground because I and the Father are in one place. We are not separate and apart from each other, and there is no God to act upon me, for I and the Father are one, and the God power acts within and out from. Once you begin to acknowledge the kingdom of God is within me, closer to me than breathing, the very place whereon I stand. Here God is. And now all that the Father hath is mine. You are now bringing about a transformation of your consciousness, which will make it fertile, which will make it the soil in which and through which the grace of God can function. As long as you are acknowledging I and the Father are one, we are inseparable and indivisible. Where I am, God is. Where God is, I am. All that the Father hath is mine. Inseparable, indivisible, one. Here and now the grace of God is, and here and now the grace of God is functioning. You are bringing about a transformation of consciousness because you're drawing back your vision from looking upstairs or outside, and you are now realizing that all that you've been seeking up in the skies or outside somewhere is operative and operating within you, just as the laws of nature are operating in the soil of this garden and in the air that surrounds this garden. Realize that within the soil and in the air and in the atmosphere above, the laws of nature are functioning. And so it is that within you and in the atmosphere about you, the grace of God is functioning. And the grace of God is functioning for the purpose revealed by the Master to heal the sick, raise the dead, feed the hungry, preach the gospel, bring comfort to the comfortless. This that performs all this has been given many names. Christ consciousness, spiritual consciousness, Buddha mind, transcendental consciousness. And what it means is your individual consciousness, when your consciousness has accepted God as one power, when your consciousness has accepted omnipresence, the presence of God where I am, when your consciousness no longer looks out to God to do something to you or for you, but lives in a constant 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me. He maketh me. He setteth for me. No future tense to it, and no asking him for it. But this is a transformed consciousness, this consciousness of David's. I need not pray to God for anything, for the Lord is my shepherd, and because of that I shall not want. He leadeth me beside still waters. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. You see, his was already the transformed consciousness before the 23rd Psalm could come out of it. And so it is that before the master could say to the crippled man, what did hinder you? Before he could say to the blind man, open your eyes, before he could say to Pilate, thou couldst have no power of me, he had to have a transformed consciousness. The old consciousness that he had as a Hebrew rabbi would not have served him and would not have performed those functions. It had to be a transformed consciousness that no longer believed in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and it could no longer believe that a woman taken in adultery should be stoned to death, and it could no longer believe that a thief should be sent to hell. He had to have a transformed consciousness that would hold within itself no condemnation for the thief on the cross, no condemnation for the woman taken in adultery, no condemnation for Judas Iscariot, but a prayer, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. There's no condemnation in that, no judgment, no criticism, no hate. That is a transformed consciousness. His old consciousness was the Hebrew consciousness. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and stone the woman to death and crucify the thief and send him to hell. But before he could heal, before he could feed, before he could experience God's grace, which was there all the time, but before he could experience it, he had to have a transformed consciousness that no longer hated or feared, that no longer believed in two powers, that no longer thought that all sinners should be burned up or something else of its nature. In other words, he had to be transformed from believing that punishment is going to heal anybody or reform them. And above all things, he had to understand, he had to have a transformed consciousness that lived constantly in the realization of one power. Not one power doing something to another power, not one power overcoming or destroying another power. He had to have a transformed consciousness which lived and moved and had its being in the realization of God as the all and only, as God, in God as the omnipresent, in God as omnipotence, in God as one. And with that transformed consciousness, he was a healer. And he was more than a healer. He was a forgiver of the sinner. Because without a consciousness of condemnation or criticism, one automatically has the power to forgive sin. In other words, sin disappears out of the consciousness of a sinner when it comes in contact with the consciousness of an individual holding no condemnation, criticism, or judgment, and yet being able to say, you're forgiven, but go and sin no more, because your very return to the old state of consciousness will bring the old state of consciousness back upon you. We wonder why, after 2 or 3 years of reading the books, or even 4 or 5, we wonder why we aren't experiencing heaven. And we believe that there is some kind of magic in the books, or some kind of magic in reciting the statements in the books, or some kind of magic in hearing the statements from the books. Let me assure you that there is only one kind of magic, and that comes from a transformed consciousness. The transformed consciousness of your practitioner or teacher can perform quite a few miracles for you, but for a transformed life, there has to be first a transformed consciousness. The good that the Master could do for anyone was limited. He acknowledged this. If I go not away, the Comforter cannot come to you. Because at most, well, you remember he fed the Hebrews one day, and they came back the next day wanting to be fed again, and he rebuked them. However, they were there, and he fed them the second time, but there's no record that he ever fed them the third time. And so it is, you must remember, that at best he could feed them for a day or 2 or 3. At best he could heal them of a few diseases. But he couldn't make their lives over for them, except in proportion as they were willing that their own consciousness be transformed. In other words, there is no such thing as vicarious salvation. Salvation is individual. There is such a thing as vicarious healing. It's going on all of the time. Practitioners and teachers healing multitudes. But be assured of this, those same multitudes are sick again next year, or next month, and the year after. And it continues until they themselves bring about a transformation of their own consciousness by taking the writings and rebuilding their consciousness through the writings, through practicing the presence of God, through practicing the principles revealed in these works. If we would spend 2 or 3 years in the transformation of our consciousness, we then would find that we could literally see the day close at hand when we would say, I live, and yet actually I'm not doing it. There's a presence within me doing it, going before me and making the crooked places straight, going before me and protecting me, going forward and supplying me. There is something other than myself functioning. But this is all done through a transformation of consciousness, and the transformation of consciousness is brought about through the practice of specific principles. And those specific principles constitute the message of the infinite way, and they're to be found in all of the writings and all of the recordings. And then the degree in which we work with them, remembering what we're doing, not trying to work magic, not trying to turn stones into bread. What we're trying to do is transform our consciousness until we arrive at the point where we actually experience experience, God is the only power, and nothing else is power. And that is it. Thank you.